I'm sure y'all are familiar with the stereotype that Appalachia is home to a bunch of recluse inbred mountain people. Most Appalachians find this offensive, and for good reason. Most of us are not inbred. Most of us have never even met or seen someone like that. But I have. I live down the road from one such family, the Mundys. For over 100 years, the Mundy family has lived at the house at the end of the road, each generation more inbred than the last. I don't want y'all to picture their home as some old, dilapidated Victorian manor that sits at the stain in a subdivision. This ain't like the Burbs or Edward Scissorhands. Make no mistake, the road I live on is unpaved and long. Manufactured homes and the occasional cabin sit on large lots spread up the mountain. These are lower to middle lower class families. There are a few retirees with new pickups, but overall, there ain't much money around here. My home sits about halfway up the road. On a fall day, when the trees are bare, I can look up the mountain and see part of the Mundy family. Now I said not to picture it as an old dilapidated Victorian manor because it's not. But it is old and dilapidated. It's larger than the rest of the homes on the road, but it's box-shaped, a Civil War era build. The paint is faded, the roof is in despair, there's junk spread across the property. Windows are broken and covered by plywood. It's seen better days, that's for sure. Actually, as the story goes, the Mundys were somewhat normal back in the day. The home was built in the 1800s by a Confederate veteran. He was married to his cousin, which I agreed ain't normal. But back then, it wasn't that frowned upon. Plus, I think they were second or third cousins, something like that. Anyways, Mr. Mundy started a local general store. It proved to be pretty popular, and Mundy became a successful businessman and a major fixture in the community. He even dabbled in local politics. Mundy and his wife had 8 children, which was a typical amount back then. 5 boys and 3 girls. A couple of the boys died young of illness, and one of the daughters was unalived by a jealous lover, whom the remaining brothers dealt with violently and with fatality. Of the remaining 5 children, Levi was the golden child. He worked the general store and had interest in politics like his father. However, unbeknownst to the parents, Levi and his sister Sarah were romantically involved. Mama Mundy died early of what was most likely cancer, and Old Man Mundy subsequently fell into deep depression. He took to the bottle pretty hard. One night he went on a drunken hike and died after tumbling down the mountain. Levi, being the favorite, inherited the store, and now that the parents were longer around to disapprove, he married his sister. Now back then you could marry a cousin, and most people wouldn't mind. But marrying your sister? Well, that merit has always been abhorred. Levi and Sarah were too in love to feel shame or embarrassment any longer, so they put the relationship out in the open for everyone to see. And that made folks pretty uncomfortable. So the locals stopped shopping at the Mundy's general store. As you can guess, no customers meant no money, so the store closed down. You might be wondering what happened to the other Mundys. Surely they weren't okay with their siblings marrying each other, bankrupting the family business, and creating little inbred babies in the house they grew up in, right? Wrong. They knew about Levi and Sarah long before the two married. And get this, they joined in on the indecency. I'll spare you the details, but story goes that there were nights that people heard some blood-curdling lovemaking taking place in that house. A real family affair. Sarah gave birth to many children, not all of which survived. And of the 6 that did, they almost certainly not were all Levi's, although they were all his blood in one way or another. When a family is so intermixed, the individual stories begin to blur. I do not know what happened to Levi and Sarah's siblings. Some stayed at home, others moved away. I can only imagine that there's some other Appalachian road with the Mundy family on it. But all I could tell you about now are the Mundys that live on my own road. They don't come out much, and when you do see them, it's like a Bigfoot sighting. You want to take a picture to prove they exist, but you also don't want to get too close. They don't drive, so they don't go into town. I don't know what they eat. They don't have electricity or plumbing. They have a well on their property, so I guess that's where they get water. There's 5 of them up there, and one really old lady. I have seen her less than the others, maybe only 3 times my entire life. I saw her when I was about 9 years old. Us kids used to sneak up the mountain to try and catch a look at the Mundys. Our parents were ignorant of this, of course. One afternoon, we got about 30 feet from the house. The front door was open, so we got a peek inside. There was a long hallway that appeared to go from the front of the house to the back. And standing in that hallway, hunched over, was the old lady. And she was looking right at us. We immediately dug down the mountain and ran home. We decided the consequences of disobedience were worth telling our parents about the old lady. They weren't happy, but I'll never forget the concern on my father's face as he looked up the mountain. Like the old lady's presence somehow made the situation more disturbing. The second time I saw her, I was 17. My dog had gotten close and caught a scent that took up the mountain. My heart sank when I saw he was going towards the Mundys' house. I reluctantly took chase and found myself on their property. It was evening time. The sun hadn't fully set. Nobody was outside that I could see, and I knew if they were, I would have been in danger. People had wandered on their property before and barely escaped with their lives. The Mundys were extremely hostile to trespassers. I whispered loudly and desperately to my dog, but he was hooked on a scent. He went to the side of the house, waving around junk that I ain't sure how they obtained. Children's toys, car parts, empty bottles and cans. My dog came to a halt to sniff whatever odor, and I snagged him by the collar. And as I turned to rush him home, there she was. She was sitting in a dirty old chair. It wasn't on a porch or in any spot where it would have made sense. She was just sitting in the yard amongst the junk. I'm often respectful, even when it's against my better judgment, so my first instinct was to apologize and tell her I was just retrieving my dog. She did not respond. She simply stared at me. I averted my gaze and promptly fled the property. She looked to be about 90 years old at the time, and aside from her sort of witchy old face, the other thing that shook me were her clothes. They looked like clothes I'd seen in pictures of women from the 1800s. The third time I saw her was a week ago, and to help you understand how weird that is, I'm nearly 30 years old. So in other words, I saw a 90-something-year-old over a decade ago, and then last week, I saw her again. Not impossible to live so long, but pretty rare, right? Especially in such poor conditions. It was late at night. I was sitting outside drinking a beer and looking at the stars when I heard the shuffling of feet coming down the dirt road. I sat up, and sure enough, I saw shadowy figures. I could tell right away that these people weren't right. Their gait was awkward. Their posture was weird. My heart skipped a beat when I counted 5 of them. It was the Mundys. They walked right past without looking at me. I was too shocked to move. I ain't never seen them come down the mountain before. I watched them continue down the road when I heard some more shuffling from the direction they came. It was the old lady. She had a long, wide dress on. I couldn't see her feet, but I heard them kicking up dirt and rock. She looked almost like she was floating. But here's the part that really gives me chills. As she hobbled in front of me, she stopped. She turned and looked directly at me, and without warning, let out a soul-piercing scream. She wasn't scared, although the scream itself was horrifying. No, this was something different. This was a call. Out of my peripheral, I saw the other Mundys sprinting back up the road. Their run was awkward like their walk. But while their walk was sort of clumsy and slow, their run was quick and powerful. I took off for my door and stumbled inside. I locked the door, grabbed one of my dad's old weapons, and shut off the lights. My parents were startled out of bed by this nightmare, and Dad rushed into the living room with another weapon drawn. I shushed him and waved him over to the window where I was peeking out of the blinds. The old woman had stopped screaming the second I had gone indoors, and now the Mundys stood side by side staring at my home. The only light was from the moon, which was not full, but this was the best look I'd ever gotten of the Mundys. 3 men, 2 women, and the old lady. They were all deformed, some worse than others. They looked like patients you'd find in an insane asylum. They looked like sub-level inmates. Other inmates lived amongst white tile and cotton sheets, but these guys looked like they would have been housed in a wet stone cellar. Too horrifying for anyone to see. My dad gasped when he laid eyes on the family all lined up on the road. "That's the old lady I saw when I was a kid," I told him. I asked him if he had any idea her relation to the younger ones, which, considering how inbred they were, is like asking someone to figure out where a circle ends. What he said still baffles me. Dad looked at me real seriously and said, "That's Sarah." I figured there must be another Sarah. The one that married Levi would be at least 140 years old by now. Not Levi's wife. She'd be too old, I argued. But Dad just looked at me. He doesn't say much, but when he does, it's precise and true. My dad ain't one for wasting words. The Mundys eventually turned and headed back down the mountain. I wanted to stay up and watch them return, but they never did. At least not back the way they came. But I've seen them since, up on their property. They must have climbed the back way, which is quite a challenge. It's steep, and there ain't any roads. I can't imagine that old lady being capable of accomplishing such a task. I kept thinking back to what Dad told me. My logical mind tells me there's no way a woman that old exists, let alone would even be capable of walking. And I hadn't even heard of an old lady even half that age with the capacity to let out such a scream. But there's something that gets me. Makes me think that she truly is Sarah. The Mundys look inbred. Their faces and bodies are contorted, but the old lady is not. At least not beyond what you'd expect from aging. From what I understand, Sarah and her siblings weren't strange looking. Their parents weren't even closely related enough to muddy up the gene pool. There ain't any records on these folks. They stop after Levi, Sarah, and their siblings. However, nobody ever found any death certificates for that bunch either. Which ain't a surprise, considering the Mundys are as reclusive as they come. They're born on the mountain, and they die on the mountain. They sure as Mayor ain't sharing family events with anyone outside of that immediate household. And if you're wondering why social services or some other government agency hasn't stepped in, well, that's a mystery as well. Perhaps it's because there's just no record of them existing. And until recently, nobody saw them outside of their property. We'd all just stay away from the end of the road and pretend they didn't exist. Live and let live, I guess. However, what I discovered this morning has made me reconsider that saying. First thing I do when I wake up each morning is get out of bed and open my blinds to let the sunlight in. Upon opening them, red light flooded my room. My eyes hadn't fully woken up, so my initial thought was that there was a wildfire. I stepped outside to look and felt that it was a clear day, blue sky and all. So I knew that it was the window itself that was red. As I got closer, that was when I saw the coagulation and bits of what appeared to be hair or fur. The entire window had been smeared with blood. My family is fine, don't worry. The police came out and took a report. They were pretty apprehensive about questioning the Mundys. Told me that the Mundys don't mess with no one. They even argued with me and said it was most likely someone I knew playing a prank. One officer even accused me of doing it myself. Screw them. I need answers. I need to know who the old lady is. And why aren't there any young kids? I find it hard to believe that this generation of mutants is the one to break tradition. Maybe I'll find something that'll convince somebody to end that nightmare and move the Mundys to someplace that ain't here. I'm going in that house.